This presentation is intended to give a brief overview of the history of Christianity in the U.S. between the years 1865 and 1915 or so. That is, between the Civil War and World War I. Here I am drawing on and supplementing material from Kester's chapter called Moving People. Her next chapter and my next presentation will be called Responses to Modernity. Some of what we discuss there will also be related to events in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century. All that to say, this material is organized not just chronologically, but also thematically. Kester's calls her chapter Moving People, and she describes significant movements of people that had a great impact on Christianity in the United States. The first, of course, is the movement of European immigrants into the United States in massive numbers. But also within the United States, people moved from rural areas to urban areas. African American peoples experienced a great migration from the rural South largely to the urban North. And people of all sorts moved from the East in the United States to the West as the demographic center of the country gradually moved westward. And of course, there was also a movement of American Christians into overseas missions. And keeping the theme of movement, her last section of the chapter might be called the movement from ignorance to knowledge, as she discusses the impact of Christian churches on education in the United States. Let's think first about immigration. The statistics themselves are startling. In 1860, there were about 30 million people living in the United States. And between that time and 1890, we received 10 million immigrants. So as many as a third of the entire population of the country when the period began. Kester notes that what she calls the first wave of immigration after the Civil War was British, German, and Scandinavian. And those folks tended to move into the small towns and rural areas of the Midwest and Great Plains. After 1890, another 15 million came before 1915. What's interesting, aside from the sheer size of the immigration, is the regions from whence they came. Now, Polish, Italian, Russian, and Greek people came in large numbers. You might not be thinking about this, but let me point out to you, whereas the first wave of Brits, Germans, and Scandinavians were from countries that were primarily Protestant, this second wave involves large numbers of Roman Catholics from Poland and to Italy, or Orthodox from Russia and Greece. This surely changes the landscape of Christianity in the U.S. in significant ways, tilting it in a more non-Protestant direction. These two maps show the shift from primarily Western European and English-speaking Europe to Southern and Eastern Europe as the source of immigration over the years. Now, surely this massive immigration of folks into the United States simply increased the diversity of languages, cultures, and religious orientations that were present and vibrant in the United States. And with that diversity comes tensions. Then, as now, there was a nativist response among many who were troubled by this massive immigration and its impact on U.S. culture. Sometimes that concern and even opposition to immigration had an anti-Catholic element. Many were more receptive to immigrants and saw the U.S. as a melting pot, where our cultural differences are boiled away as people assimilate into a common American culture. Of course, others aspire to our being a salad bowl, where each group retains their distinct identity in a tossed salad of diversity. Kester cites immigration scholar John Jardy, who describes two kinds of tensions related to massive immigration. The first is a tension between pluralism and particularism. Kester writes that, quote, the United States was becoming an increasingly pluralistic society in which even religion was a matter of personal opinion. I don't think this is completely adequate in describing the pluralistic ideal. What she and Jerry are getting at, I think, is a unity or commonality around public ideals related to liberty, toleration, and the sort of civil religion related to the United States as a chosen nation. And our differences, partly defined by the various Christian denominations to which we adhere, are largely seen as private matters, irrelevant to our public life. Particularists, however, and Jurdy suggested that many immigrants held to this perspective, believed it was necessary to preserve one particular cultural and religious identity over against the corroding impact of the American melting pot that created a common identity and culture. The other tension Jurdy talks about is between American individualism and European collectivism. Kesters writes that European immigrants often arrived as extended families and lived collectively. The family determined where its members would live and work and whom they would marry. The pastor or priest determined what was to be believed. For a great many immigrants, life was communal and survival depended on mutual support of a family or ethnic group. In contrast, the American ideal was for individuals to make their own way in the world." Unquote. You should recognize the impact of Protestant evangelical revivalism on this individualism in American culture. You will recall that revival emphasis on an individual conversion experience unmediated by the beliefs, the practices, and the fellowship of a particular traditional church. That emphasis on individual experience nourishes individualism in the entire U.S. cultural context. Along with a movement into the United States, there was movement into the cities within the country. That is called urbanization, and it was surely nourished by immigration, but even native-born people moved toward the cities in large numbers during this period. Notice these startling statistics. In 1870, only 1 in 4 people in the United States lived in urban areas, but by 1920, half do. This process continued into the 20th century, so that by the dawn of the 21st, 4 of 5 in the United States live in cities. Think about the effects of this. People in rural areas and small towns generally have deep connections to their extended families, and there are few options for familiarity with other cultures or perspectives than one's own. A move to the city often cuts people off from their deep attachments to the people and the only way of life they have ever known, and it increases their experience of diverse cultures and perspectives. Many people have noted a kind of moral dissolution as a result of this. That is, a breaking down of the power of traditional ways of life and traditional moral values among people once they lose the support and reinforcement of a homogeneous community to which one is deeply attached, and once those values and ways of life are challenged by other values and ways of life not heard of before. Consider this quotation. "The growing evils of urbanization include juvenile delinquency, prostitution, various addictions, crimes, and suicides. It has led to rampant destruction of the environment. To crown this all, urbanization contributes to the loss of moral values and deteriorating sense of brotherhood among the locals. Urbanization, besides creating slums, has also denied a large section of people even elementary civic amenities like pure drinking water, electricity, proper drainage systems, hospitals, etc. Overcrowding has become a serious problem as a large additional population is bound to complicate matters. Good medical facilities, day-to-day requirements of life, proper schooling and the like have become very expensive, and only the affluent are able to afford these. The masses, including the middle class, are only able to maintain themselves up to the level of subsistence, and the means of comfort have become means of luxury for them. The educated youth, in spite of having a good education and professional knowledge, cannot stand the competition, and are usually an exploited lot at the hands of affluent industrialists and company owners. And finally, the worst of all, this influx is responsible for the slow destruction of our identity. We can easily imagine someone writing this in the late 19th or early 20th century in the United States, worrying over the negative effects of urbanization. Interestingly, this is actually from a website in India and was written in 2011 about the problems created by urbanization in India, not the United States. People are flocking to cities largely as a result of industrialization, which means that more and more jobs are available in the cities where factories are located. Some have seen three periods of intense industrialization in U.S. history. First was in the early 19th century when cotton became king because of the development of both the cotton gin and textile manufacturing processes. A second industrial revolution is taking place during the period we are considering, and this contributes mightily to the urbanization, or it's a significant factor in explaining what drew people to cities. Put simply, jobs. Industrialization has many positive effects on productivity, the creation of wealth and jobs. It's part of what draws immigrants to the United States and to its cities. Of course, it also produces air pollution and strengthens the ability of the wealthy captains of industry to exploit their workers, who compete against each other for low-paying factory jobs. There was great labor unrest during this period in U.S. history, strikes by workers that were violently suppressed by wealthy factory owners. The accumulation of wealth by a few also led to the corruption of our democracy, as the wealthy were able to use their wealth to influence government officials. We will see in the presentation related to Kester's next chapter that there was a significant Christian response to these realities called the social gospel movement. But that waits our next presentation. As I suggested, the second wave of immigration during this period came from countries that were predominantly Catholic, and it resulted in significant numerical growth for the Roman Catholic Church in the United States. You will recall that at the birth of the nation there were only a few Catholics in the United States, about 30,000, mostly in Maryland. There was significant growth in the antebellum or pre-Civil War period, so that by the time of the Civil War, the Roman Catholic Church was as large as the Methodist Church, though still a minority in relation to Protestants as a whole. But look at the situation in 1910, when the Catholic population has grown from 3 to 15 million, and in only a few years, they will be 37% of the U.S. population. It's really kind of amazing, isn't it, that we didn't have a Roman Catholic Church until President Kennedy in 1960. Well, I meant, of course, a Roman Catholic president until 1960. The Roman Catholic Church was largely an immigrant church. It grew not through conversion of non-Catholics, but as a result of immigration. Kester points out that there was a strong anti-Catholic element in the nativist anti-immigration movement. Pay attention to the excerpt from Protestant clergyman Josiah Strong in Kester's on page 141, where he describes the threat of Catholicism, which he sees as an anti-democratic force, given what he calls the Catholic belief in the sovereignty or authority of the Pope rather than the authority of the people. The Roman Catholic Church was largely organized into national parishes. Catholic parish boundaries often reflected the residential concentration of people from particular parts of the world, and the parish catered to the ways of Irish, Polish, Catholic, or Italian immigrants. There was often tension between various national parishes and the Roman Catholic hierarchy, which tended to be Irish. It even went so far as to result in the creation of a separate Polish national church at one point. Kester's has an interesting discussion of tensions between the Irish Catholic hierarchy and the Catholic Church in the Southwest, with its ancient roots in Spanish exploration from the earliest period of colonization in North and Central America. She says that in the Southwest, where priests had always been few in number and weekly mass a rarity, a very different sort of Catholicism had developed, with elements of syncretism between Christian and indigenous beliefs. It was quite different from that of European Catholicism, and so as the Catholic Church in America strengthened and the Irish Catholic dominance of the church strengthened, there was tension with Catholicism in the Southwest. A final point to be made here is that Protestant efforts to convert Roman Catholics to Protestantism largely failed. Catholicism in the United States produced some distinctive institutional expressions. Maybe the most noteworthy are the convents, where celibate women gathered for a life shaped by shared prayer and liturgy, and often service, particularly in parochial schools as teachers, but also as nurses in hospitals. We've talked about labor unrest during this period. One of the earliest effective labor unions was the Knights of Labor, which was composed of Roman Catholic immigrant laborers and saw itself as a Roman Catholic institution. Also noteworthy by the end of the period under consideration was the National Catholic Welfare Conference, which coordinated the schools, hospitals, and labor unions related to the church, but also produced insightful commentaries on the political, social, and particularly economic issues that challenged people in the United States throughout the 20th century. You should be aware of something called the Americanist controversy in the Roman Catholic Church. It had to do with the tension between typically American cultural values and practices associated with democracy and those of the Catholic Church. It was precipitated largely by the publication of a biography of a man named Isaac Hecker, who was himself a Protestant convert to Catholicism. Many European Catholics who read this biography became convinced that in the U.S., Catholicism was becoming too Americanized, too individualistic, too innovative rather than traditional in its approach. Bishop John Ireland of Minneapolis, whose work you can get a glimpse of on page 142 in Kester's, defended the compatibility between Roman Catholicism and American democracy. In response to all of this, Pope Leo XIII, who also wrote a scathing criticism of the exploitation of workers in Europe and the United States, officially condemned what he called Americanism, and specifically the separation of church and state, and the idea that church teaching could be altered to accommodate local or particular national realities. You should be aware that it was not until Vatican II in the 1960s that the separation of church and state and religious liberty were fully affirmed by the Roman Catholic Church. This indicates that concerns about Catholicism, like those expressed by Josiah Strong, were not entirely a result of intolerance or bigotry against Catholicism or Catholic immigrants. This concludes our look at immigration and urbanization, which were largely Catholic phenomenon. And next time we will look at the other movements that Kester's names in her chapter.